How can something as immaterial as consciousness ever arise from something as unconscious as matter? This is the hard problem in physics, and physics, by itself, has no answer. Physicist Peter Russell has been engaged in a lifelong exploration into the nature of matter and consciousness. He was supervised by Stephen Hawking at Cambridge, where he graduated with highest honors. And he studied consciousness through meditation in India, where he realized that through a synthesis of the scientific and the mystical, we can see the hard problem for what it really is, and we can begin to heal ourselves and the planet. After reading his books, I realized that fundamentally, Peter's quest has been my quest also, and perhaps it has been yours as well. I had some questions, and since he lives nearby in Sausalito, California, I emailed him, and he agreed to this interview. Peter, in your book, From Science to God, you write that you've always been a scientist at heart with an especial interest in maths. Can you tell us a bit about your early interest in science?
Yes, I was always interested in science. As a kid, I was fascinated by that and mathematics, and then when I went to university, I just naturally studied that because that's what I was good at. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think I was just born with that inclination to want to understand how things work. I love just understanding how things work, and still do.
Mm-hmm. I think some of us don't know that actually it's maths, plural, and not math. Why is that?
Well, it's mathematics.
Yeah.
And in America, it's shortened to maths.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's short for mathematics or maths, but it's just an abbreviation.
Yeah. You also described yourself as a young atheist, and the ceremony of confirmation just confirmed your aversion to church dogma. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yes, well, I grew up not particularly religious. We went to church on Sundays, sort of about once a month as a routine really, and then about age 13 I went through the process of confirmation, where you become a confirmed member of the church, and I realised that things like the Nicene Creed, Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, who was born of a virgin, all that stuff was something I was meant to believe and sign off on. It was an actual creed, and I thought, no way can I sign off on this as a belief, and so I just told my parents that was it. I'd had it with the church.
Yeah.
Too much dogma.
Right. And since your idea of God now is so much different from what it was before, what was your conception of God at this time when you were younger?
I think my conception of God when I was younger was, what everybody was taught, some almighty father figure being up there in heaven somewhere, which was assumed to be up in the sky, looking over us, looking after us, wanting us to be good people and all that stuff. That was the traditional idea of God that I was brought up with.
So being a scientist, that was irrational for you?
Yeah, being a scientist, that was, yes, totally irrational. And that's what I realised, was if I had a choice between believing what the church was telling me and believing what science was telling me about the universe, it was a very simple choice. I believed science.
Mm-hmm. Would you consider your interest in science at that time kind of almost a religious calling?
I wouldn't say my interest in science was religious, no. Mm-hmm. I think religion for me is a matter of almost blind faith, of taking on faith what someone else is telling you. Whereas the interesting thing for science, for me, what I like about science is it's experimental. You're not asked to believe anything. But when experiment proves something, or when reasoning proves it's true, then you take it on. But the basic principle of science is a healthy skepticism, that you don't believe things just because you're told.
Mm-hmm. But you experimented with altered states of consciousness at this time.
I was experimenting a little bit with things that kids do, like, self-hypnosis, spinning myself around when I became dizzy and things like that, and flashing lights in front of my eyes, those sorts of things that I think a lot of kids do.
Yeah. And you had talks with your friends about this, about free will, and is the mind the same as the brain, and so on?
Yeah, I had lots of discussions with my fellow students. I got fascinated by the brain-mind problem. How was mind separate from the brain? Was it created by the brain? And also the whole question of free will and determinism. I suppose when I was about 15, I was discussing this, do we really have free will, or science says it's all just an unfolding of mechanistic principles, so maybe everything is determined and we don't have free will.
Right. And what conclusions did you come to about free will at that time?
At that time, I think I didn't come to any conclusions on either of these questions. I left them both pretty open, and they're still open. I mean, these are two questions which totally fascinate me today.
Mm-hmm. At Cambridge, you studied experimental psychology and theoretical physics? Or
Yes.
some variation? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I started off studying mathematics,
Yes.
and then I moved into theoretical physics, which is actually at Cambridge, it's exactly the same curriculum. Applied mathematics and theoretical physics are actually the same. And then I added psychology, and that was partly because I realised that physics was never going to give me the answers to the questions I was really interested in, which were things about the mind and consciousness, and I thought psychology would answer that, but it didn't. I mean, I learned a lot about the brain and perception and memory and nerve cells and all of that, but no one was really interested in consciousness itself.
Your supervisor at Cambridge was Stephen Hawking.
Yes, at Cambridge there's a system, you have a unique one-to-one relationship with a supervisor. It's like a tutor. And for a while Stephen Hawking was my supervisor, which meant that I'd go and I'd have a session with him every week and just go over my studies, how I was doing, etc.
And what kinds of things would you discuss?
Basically it would be discussing the lectures, what was in the lectures, and also we were set questions each week. He'd set me questions to work on and problems to solve, and then I'd come back and probably half of them I hadn't solved, and he'd go over with me how to solve them, that sort of thing. So it was like having a personal tutor.
Right. Had his disease come to a point where he was still fluent, or?
His illness, Lou Gehrig's, or it's actually a subtle variation of that. He'd been diagnosed with that about 3-4 years before I was with him, but he was still coping pretty well. He was still walking. He needed a stick to walk, mm-hmm. and his speech was getting a bit slurred, but he was basically okay. Though even then we thought he only had a few years left to live, but we knew he was onto something brilliant. That's when he was doing his early work on mm-hmm. black holes.
Yeah. During this time when he was your supervisor, was it just you and he at that time? Well, that was quite a privilege.
Yes, so it's a one-to-one relationship. You have a single person with a single supervisor. Mm-hmm. I mean, he might have been supervising 2 or 3 other people.
I think at this time he was working on black holes.
Yes, yeah. That's where he was doing his early work on black holes and showing that black holes actually radiate energy, what's now called Hawking energy.
Mm-hmm. Did he discuss that with you?
No.
Oh, okay. At one point in your studies, did you come across this anomaly of consciousness and what is now called the hard problem?
I think that was always there in the back of my mind, what's called the hard problem. As I said, back at school I was interested in the brain-mind, and the question is, how come the brain, which is purely, we think of it as purely physical material, the grey substance of the brain, how does that create experience? I mean, right now I'm experiencing you, I'm experiencing this room. Where does experience come from? Is it produced by the brain, or does the brain merely condition the experience? And the reason that's called the hard problem is because there's no obvious explanation for consciousness. There's lots of different theories, but no obvious explanation.
Mm-hmm. At this time, did you feel that consciousness must have been a product of evolution?
At that stage, I didn't really quite know what to think about consciousness. It was an enigma. Mm-hmm. So I think I was just fascinated by it, and gradually I got more and more interested in Eastern teachings about consciousness. Yeah. The East were the people who'd really sort of explored consciousness and looked at it in depth, because they seem to be the people who'd really explored consciousness firsthand, and that's the way I think you have to explore consciousness, is by examining your own consciousness. You study the brain and things, that tells you certain things, but only when you look at your own consciousness can you really begin to understand it.
Right. And what did you do to look at your own consciousness?
I started meditating then. As I got drawn into Eastern mysticism, I got drawn into looking at meditation, studying meditation, as a way of basically quietening the mind to begin to observe one's own experience.
Mm-hmm. And did you do this in England?
I was at Cambridge, I was doing this in England at that time. Later I went out to India. A couple of years later I went out to India to study there, but when I first started I was at Cambridge.
Right. So at what point did you go to India?
I went off to India in 1969, fall of 1969, once I finished my undergraduate studies. Yes, I drove off to India. From England you can drive to India. You could in those
Really?
days. Yeah.
Oh. How long did that take you?
8 days.
Wow.
Driving day and night. There's 6 of us in a van. We drove day and night.
Yeah.
At that time you could drive through Iran, Afghanistan.
And what was your impression of those countries?
Amazing, beautiful, beautiful people, beautiful culture. I loved it.
Uh-huh.
Such a shame what's happened to them, particularly Afghanistan. I mean, this was before the Russians had invaded or anybody. It was.
Yeah. I hear that Kabul was once a magnificently beautiful city.
Yes, it was lovely, beautiful. Yeah, I remember the bazaars there. And I remember, just the fields alongside the roads and things in Afghanistan. Yeah, it was just the people, the shepherds with their sheep and people tilling the fields. It was. Yeah.
And where in India did you study meditation?
I then went to Rishikesh, which is where it's a holy city in India where the Ganges comes out of the Himalayas. And I lived there for about 6 months, well, a good part of 6 months, studying with the Maharishi, studying transcendental meditation.
And during this time, did your orientation toward spirituality change? Did your view of religion change? Did your view of God change?
I think what happened there in India was my whole attitude to spirituality, well, to religion changed. As I said, I rejected religion when I was a kid, just because it just didn't make any sense. And what I realized in India was there was something to it, right? So there was something to spirituality. What I saw was all the world's religions, there was a common truth to them. I became fascinated by that common truth, which was basically saying we don't function at our full capacity, our consciousness is limited, it's like we have blinkers on, and you can talk about that whether it's in terms of the ego or getting attached to our desires or whatever it is, but I found all spiritual teachings underneath were saying the same thing, and all were teaching practices that would help us awaken to our true nature. And so I became interested in what was the common core that underlay all the spiritual teachings rather than the differences between them. A lot of people are concerned with the differences. What does one religion say? What does another religion say? I was interested in where are they saying the same thing.
Could you have learned about this at Cambridge?
No. I think at Cambridge and at any Western university, the closest study you could get to it was what was called comparative religion, and I did actually have a friend who was a professor of comparative religion at Lancaster University, and that's exactly what it says. It's comparative religion. It's comparing the different religions, looking at their differences
rather than their similarities.
Rather than their similarities, and that's what I was fascinated by, was the similarities. Because I felt if there's a truth to religion and people feel there's a deep truth to them, then that truth must be a truth that's true for all people, whatever their culture. And I think what's happened over time is as that truth's been passed down from one person to another, it's gradually got distorted, bits have been left out, other bits have been added in, it's been sort of integrated into the culture of the time. And so we end up with very different expressions of what was once, I think, a very common understanding.
So you began to learn about the perennial philosophy from its source.
Yes.
From the source of religion.
Yes. Yeah. I would say that's what I was interested in, was what was the core experience. And so for me, practicing meditation was one way to begin to get down to understanding that core experience, which sort of inspired all the great spiritual traditions.
Peter, when you were at Cambridge, you were confronted with the hard problem. In other words, how can something as immaterial as consciousness arise from something as unconscious as the matter of the brain? You went to India to study the science of meditation, and I think this helped you a bit crystallize your views on the hard problem and a different orientation toward that. So can you talk to us about this?
Yes. as I said earlier, I think the hard problem raised its head for me when I was a kid, so this whole question of where did consciousness come from. And India, this Indian philosophy, studying Indian philosophy, I realised they were saying that consciousness was always there, like it was the foundation of the cosmos. But so for many years I had this sort of this conflict going on in my mind about, you know, between what Eastern religion said and what scientists said about, you know, science was saying consciousness is created by the brain, and in a way Eastern teachings were saying the opposite, that consciousness came first and we came out of that. And it was only actually probably about 15 years ago that it all came together for me, when I realised we were just making some fundamental assumptions in the West, and we were stuck in a paradigm that was really saying the nature of reality, the ultimate nature of reality is physical. And what I realised was everything I know is actually within my own mind, within my own consciousness. And so there's a sense in which consciousness is more fundamental in terms of my experience. And as I started looking into that more, I came to the realization that consciousness is in everything. It's like, we are conscious, but we accept that animals are also conscious, and realized you couldn't draw a line anywhere, that there was everything had its own inner world of experience. And that's very contrary to the Western scientific view, but the Western scientific view has a lot of problems. So for example, if you assume that consciousness somehow comes out of the brain, then you're really saying something magic happens, that out of, and this is the hard problem, you're saying out of dead, inanimate, unconscious matter, experience somehow comes into being. And you have to say below the line, maybe, vertebrates have it, maybe, dogs, rats, fishes have consciousness, but spiders don't. So what is the difference between a spider's nervous system and a fish? Or if you say, well, spiders do, but flies don't, what's the difference? And there's somewhere you have this leap from dead, inanimate matter into conscious beings. And if you take the view that consciousness goes all the way down, then you don't have to make that leap. What has evolved over time is not consciousness has suddenly emerged, but what happens in consciousness has evolved. So as the senses have got more complex and the nervous system more complex, so the picture that arises in consciousness gets richer and more complex.
Was this in any way at variance with what you had been taught at Cambridge?
Oh yes, this was totally the opposite of the Western scientific worldview. Totally opposite.
Yes.
It still is.
Yeah.
But
so you were at a very prestigious university, and in your own mind, you were seeing the world in a completely different way. Was there ever a point when you felt something like alienation, or when you felt like you were pushing off from a familiar shore and going off into the unknown, when you were a little bit unsure about what to think?
There was a time, and I think it was the time when I was debating what to do near my final year in Cambridge, where I was realizing physics wasn't going to answer the questions I was interested in, and didn't quite know what to do, didn't quite know where to turn. I knew physics wasn't the answer. I thought maybe philosophy would help, but I realized at Cambridge it was just studying dead philosophers, and so in the end that's when I moved to psychology, but that didn't really help either. And so it was only when I got into understanding Eastern philosophy that things began to move for me.
I think you were studying meditation for a PhD thesis?
Yes. When I came back from India, I went to another university, Bristol University, and I was looking at the physiology of meditation, studying the effects of meditation on the brain.
What did you learn from that?
What I learned from that was it became clear that what meditation was doing was in fact the exact opposite to stress. That when we get stressed, our bodies, our breathing tenses up, our muscles tenses up, the heartbeat increases, and you find the brain goes into a more tense, excited state. And during meditation you find the exact opposite happens. The body relaxes, the heartbeat slows down, the blood chemistry changes, and the brain goes into a much quieter, more resting state.
I think mainstream science has a tendency to dismiss evidence which might undermine their axioms. Such things as near-death experiences, where the brain flatlines and yet the people who have this experience an enhanced consciousness. Have you delved into this?
I haven't really looked at near-death experiences particularly. No, I'm not in any deep way. I'm fascinated by them. I've read about them, as have many people, but I mean, who knows what's going on there? But it's fascinating just how so many people have the same sort of experience there, of just going into the light, of feeling that sense of deep peace and being loved, which, interestingly enough, is very similar to what happens in deep meditation. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, in India you call deep meditation samadhi, and they say death is maha samadhi, the great samadhi. And so you could say that, you know, they some of them see meditation as a practice that you really experience death consciously.
Right. Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Perennial Philosophy and the Doors of Perception, said that the brain and nervous system are a reducing valve, and that the purpose of the brain and the nervous system is to essentially reduce omniscient consciousness so that one can function in a three-dimensional world. Any thoughts on that?
I take a different view from that. I see the brain and the nervous system, they condition consciousness. I see consciousness on its own is just pure awareness. But it needs the brain in order to create something to be aware of. So it's a bit like, I suppose, a film projector on a screen. If you don't have a film, you just have white light on the screen. Mm-hmm. And what the film does is give the light colour and shape and movement, so you have a film you can watch. And I think the brain plays a similar role. And so everything that happens in consciousness is conditioned by the brain, but it's not actually creating the light itself. Mm-hmm. And so the brain determines what appears in consciousness.
Mm-hmm. I was talking with a quantum physicist the other day, and he brought up two ways of looking at consciousness. One is upward causation, and the other is downward causation. Upward causation, evolution starts with atoms and molecules and goes to organisms and then to the brain, and consciousness is considered an epiphenomenon of the brain. Whereas in downward causation, consciousness is considered the ground of being, and the superconscious in some way has a role in guiding the course of evolution. Which of these, if any, do you tend to most agree with?
Neither.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's either upward or downward causation. I would say it's something that happens in parallel. Mm-hmm. That I think there's an element of awareness in everything, but as you go, down to lower levels of evolution, there's less and less and less awareness. So it isn't that matter evolved to a point where consciousness suddenly appeared, but matter and consciousness were evolving together. And as the universe got more complex, so what appeared in consciousness got more and more complex. Mm-hmm. So I see the two co-evolved.
I see. In your book I read that a single molecule of DNA, if its information were printed out, would fill a 6,000-page book. It is mind-boggling how information can be encoded in this way, and then in the process of reproduction, different DNAs can combine perfectly. That seems miraculous, and it would seem to me that it would almost have to be informed by some kind of consciousness to guide it along.
I don't think we need to invoke consciousness to explain DNA. Uh-huh. I think DNA might have its own very, very, very faint glimmer of consciousness. I would say it's not completely absent. But I think what's happened there is just through the process of evolution, and we don't fully understand it, but we're beginning to now, that, a system has evolved that's a very efficient replicating system for encoding information. Mm-hmm. And I think it's marvelous what it does. It's incredible, but it's had billions of years to evolve itself. Right. I believe that these things have evolved over time, And what we're seeing in the present day, billions of years later, is the result of selection of the processes that work best.
So when you were first confronted with the issue of the hard problem, you said maybe we need a different paradigm. Maybe consciousness is primary.
Yes, and that's the conclusion I've come to, is that consciousness is primary in the sense that consciousness is fundamental to everything, and that in the end I see the universe as a field of consciousness which is interacting with itself, and we are observing that field of consciousness. So I'm observing your field of consciousness, I'm observing the whole world around me is in a sense a field of consciousness.
So we are the universe fulfilling itself.
We are the universe observing itself, and through observing itself, fulfilling itself. I think the universe is a self-observing system, and we are getting to the stage where that's what's fascinating, whereby we are observing the world around us, and I think all animals observe the world immediately around them, but we can look much deeper. We can look down into molecules, down into atoms, we can look out into space, we can look back in time, but we can also look at ourselves, and we are the only species, I think, that is aware of its own awareness. We are aware that we are aware. We can notice our own thinking. And so through us, that capacity to know has reached a zenith insofar as we are knowing the whole of the world around us and the world within us. And that to me is what makes human beings so fascinating and exciting.